Rain hammered against the bus window as Grace Harper pressed her forehead to the cold glass, trying to steady her breath. She had taken long rides before, but none felt as heavy as this one. Her fingers trembled around the letter she'd folded and unfolded 100 times. Final notice. Those words felt like stones on her chest. Her mother's medicine was running out. Time was running out. And Grace had nowhere else to turn. The bus hissed to a stop at a lonely station. Through the blur of rain, she saw a woman rushing toward her, Mara, her co-worker from the small bakery. She looked worried, breathless, as if she had chased the bus just to find Grace. "I found something," Mara said, tugging her hood back. "It's strange, but it pays more than anything you've ever had." Grace blinked, unsure. "What kind of job?" Mara hesitated, lowering her voice. "A private nanny position. The employer is a wealthy man. But the child? She hasn't spoken in 2 years." Grace's heart skipped. Not out of fear, out of the quiet pull of curiosity. Why a child would fall silent for so long made something gentle stir inside her. Mara continued, "He's offering triple the normal salary. He wants someone patient. Someone who can bring comfort." Grace looked at her trembling hands. She wasn't sure she had comfort left to give anyone. But her mother's pale face flashed through her mind. She couldn't lose her. Not without trying everything. The rain softened outside, almost as if the world was waiting for her answer. Grace inhaled deeply, then whispered, "I'll go." She didn't know it yet, but this decision would lead her to a mansion filled with cold silence, a girl trapped in her own world, and a moment that would change everything, a moment no one believed possible. The taxi stopped at the foot of a long stone driveway, and Grace stepped out slowly, staring at the towering estate ahead. The mansion rose from the mist like a silent giant, beautiful, perfect, and strangely cold. Tall windows reflected the gray sky, and trimmed hedges lined the path as if guarding secrets no one dared touch. Grace wrapped her coat tighter. Something about this place felt frozen, untouched by warmth for a long time. The front door opened before she could knock. A tall man stood there, sharply dressed yet carrying an exhaustion that softened his features. His eyes, deep and distant, held the weight of someone who had forgotten what peace felt like. "You must be Grace," he said quietly. "I'm Adrian Wells." His voice was firm, but there was a faint tremble beneath it. He stepped aside. "Come in." Grace entered cautiously. Every surface gleamed, every picture frame was perfectly aligned, but the silence felt unnatural, like a house that remembered laughter but hadn't heard it in years. Adrian led her through a long hallway filled with family portraits. Grace paused at one of them, a smiling woman holding a little girl with bright eyes and golden hair. A family full of light. But the frame below it was empty, its glass cracked slightly at the corner as if removed in a hurry. Adrian noticed her glance but said nothing. Instead he stopped at the bottom of a grand staircase. "My daughter Arya is upstairs. She's 7. She hasn't spoken since the night her mother left." His voice faltered just for a heartbeat. "She needs someone who won't force her. Someone who understands quiet." Grace nodded gently. She felt something shift inside her, a pull she couldn't explain. She followed Adrian up the staircase, each step echoing softly like distant memories. At the top he pointed to a pale blue door. "She's in there." Grace reached for the knob, her pulse quickening. She wasn't sure what she would find behind that door, but she sensed one thing clearly: this child wasn't just silent. She was hurting. And somehow, Grace felt that their lives were about to intertwine in a way neither of them expected, maybe even needed. Grace pushed the door open slowly, letting the soft creak announce her instead of her voice. The room was spacious but dim, as though the curtains had learned to block out more than sunlight. Soft toys sat neatly on shelves, untouched, their colors fading under layers of quiet. Near the window, curled up on a small cushioned bench, sat Arya. The little girl's knees were pulled to her chest, her golden hair hiding half her face. She wasn't looking at Grace, she was staring at the garden below, where winter roses trembled in the cold breeze. Grace stepped inside gently, careful not to disturb the stillness that seemed to protect Arya like fragile glass. "I'm Grace," she whispered softly, not expecting an answer. She sat on the floor, far enough to give the child space but close enough to show she wasn't afraid of silence. Grace noticed a small wooden bird lying on the carpet, one wing broken. She picked it up and moved it toward Arya slowly, making it hop clumsily. "I think he tried to fly," she murmured, "but he needs someone to help him." The wooden bird toppled onto its side dramatically. Grace let out a quiet gasp, pretending to be shocked. For a moment, Arya didn't react. Then her shoulders twitched, the tiniest flinch, as if she was fighting the urge to turn toward the fallen toy. That single movement made Grace's heart tighten. There was something alive in this silence. Something waiting. Grace placed the little bird close to Arya's bench and whispered, "I'll be here every day. Even if you don't speak. Even if you never look at me. I won't leave." Arya didn't move, but Grace noticed her grip on the window ledge loosen ever so slightly, like a child who wanted to trust but had forgotten how. And in that small shift, Grace felt the first whisper of hope. Days passed in quiet rhythms. Grace arrived each morning, carrying soft voices instead of words, stories told through gentle gestures and patient smiles. Arya stayed silent, but slowly the walls around her began to feel less like prisons and more like fragile shelters. One afternoon, Grace found Arya sitting by the fireplace, tracing shapes in the dust on the mantelpiece. Without a word, Grace joined her, drawing a small heart with her finger beside Arya's lines. The girl's eyes flickered toward her for the briefest moment, then darted away, like a frightened bird unsure if it could trust the hand reaching out. Determined not to rush, Grace brought a small journal the next day. She wrote simple sentences and drew pictures, showing Arya that words could be friends, not foes. At first, Arya only watched, her silence deep and unbroken. But Grace kept returning, weaving stories in colors and shapes, letting Arya's world slowly stretch beyond the walls of her own silence. One chilly evening, the house was wrapped in stillness when Grace found Arya sitting by the window, a small smile flickering at the corner of her lips. Grace's heart leapt. Maybe, just maybe, the silence was beginning to crack. It was then that Grace whispered to herself, "Sometimes healing speaks louder than words." One morning, as soft sunlight spilled through the curtains, Grace noticed something new. Arya had left the bench and was sitting on the floor, closer than ever before. Her eyes, usually distant, now followed Grace's every movement with quiet curiosity. Grace held her breath, afraid to break the fragile connection they were building. Slowly she reached into her bag and pulled out a small music box. With trembling fingers she wound it up, and a gentle melody filled the room, a tune soft enough to touch the heart without rushing it. Arya's lips parted slightly, and for a fleeting moment, a spark of sound escaped, an almost whisper, fragile and uncertain. Grace's eyes widened, hope blossoming like the first flower after a harsh winter. The next days were filled with small miracles. Arya began humming along, then speaking a few words, halting but full of meaning. Grace encouraged every sound, every attempt, knowing that behind those hesitant words lay years of pain and fear waiting to be released. One evening, as the stars blinked outside the window, Arya finally looked Grace in the eyes and said clearly, "Thank you." In that moment the silence broke, not just in the house but in their hearts. Grace knew this was only the beginning of a new story, a story of hope, trust, and the impossible made real. Months passed, and the house that once felt like a cold fortress began to hum with life. Arya's laughter, once a distant memory, now echoed softly through the halls. Grace watched as the little girl blossomed, not just in words but in spirit. One evening, Adrian invited Grace to the garden, where the winter roses had started to bloom again. His eyes, tired but grateful, met hers. "You did what no one else could," he said quietly. Grace shook her head, knowing the truth. It was Arya who had found her voice inside herself, and Grace had simply held the light until it could shine again. Arya stood nearby, holding her mother's favorite scarf, a symbol of the love that still lingered despite the silence and absence. She looked up and smiled at Grace with a confidence that was once unimaginable. The impossible had happened, a silence broken not by force, but by kindness and patience. And in that quiet victory, everyone found hope. Grace knew that healing wasn't a moment but a journey. And as the stars blinked above the mansion, she whispered a promise to herself. No matter what came next, she would never stop believing in the power of a gentle heart to change a life.